chat. So we got a good rally of people the last couple of days.
Sustainable, socially inclusive, and environmentally resilient. And that is expressed through the framing of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 169 targets, and 230 key performance indicators. Historically, the international community signed up to spend approximately 0.7% of the world's gross domestic product, approximately 500 billion United States dollars annually to fund international development. But it is then argued that even if all nations manage to raise 0.7% of GDP, this will not be sufficient to realistically finance our common future. Globally, prior to COVID-19, some estimate a gap of approximately $2.5 trillion annually to fund the implementation of the SDGs in developing countries. A recent report prior to COVID estimates that Nigeria needs approximately $85 billion annually to sufficiently fund the SDGs. Indeed, as the Nigeria SDG report 2019 noted, that funding remains a critical challenge to overcome in the implementation of the SDGs, and suggests the need to work fast in scaling up efforts to expand the fiscal space for the SDGs implementation in Nigeria. Because there is need now to look into ways of mobilizing additional resources and minimizing waste in the application of scarce public resources. There is need to draw on non-traditional sources of public finance, public-private partnerships, impact investments, as well as strategic bonds as appropriate. It is for this reason that this webinar series is not only timely, but suitable as well. As we carefully deliberate in this on these pertinent issues, please bear in mind that we need the expertise and financial resources of all, the public and the private sector, the development partners, the scientific community, and the wider civil society in support of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in Africa. I hope that this will strengthen our commitment to the achievement of the global goals in Africa. Once again, congratulations, and I wish you all a productive webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bala. Really appreciate your comments, and we please pass our regards to Her Excellency and let her know that we received her sentiments broadly across the webinar. So right now we'll invite our first speaker, and we'll come back to Dr. Bala a bit later. So right now I do want to bring in Nkiru Chemelu. She's a Senior Manager, Global Operations at UN Global Compact. She heads the Global Compact Africa Regional Office based out of Johannesburg. And in this role, she works with a global system of more than 60 local networks, including 10 local networks in Africa. So Dr. Nkiru, welcome, thank you. And thank you so much for making time to join us. Please, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Frank, and thank you to AVPA for the invitation to speak on this very important and extremely relevant topic. I think the topic of financing the SDGs is even more on the forefront of public and private global discussions because of the COVID-19 crisis that we're in. So I was asked here to speak and share some challenges from a Pan-African perspective from the UN Global Compact. We are the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. We operate in over 70 countries around the world, but we have signatory participants, both business and non-business, from about 160 countries. So we do very much have a global view in terms of what are the trends around business engagement and contribution to sustainable development and to the SDGs writ large, but also, of course, views at the country level and at the regional level as well. So to the question as to, what are the main challenges for mobilizing finance around the SDGs? There are many, so I'll really just focus on the ones that are most pertinent to the work that we do at the Global Compact. Obviously, there's the challenge of the fact that there is money captured that is lost through illicit financial flows, and that takes out a huge chunk and is a big contributor to the gap between the existing finances that are there and the finances that are needed to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And then there's also a challenge in terms of money that is not captured to be gains, which is through the lack of taxes. So this is a lack of formal taxation, lack of progressive taxation policies, as well as just a very small tax base that exists across Africa. But one of the main challenge I want to talk about is really how we look at development, particularly development finance. And Frank alluded to this earlier, and Dr. Bala also discussed the need for more innovative means of financing. And I think that's really where the conversation needs to lie, is very much in terms of how we think about development and reframing development finance. Because as we all know, ODA is decreasing steadily, and that seems to be the downward trend for that, which has typically been the main source of financing development. And so traditional financial flows for development are changing. And so now we need to look at more innovative new models for financing development. But still, I think the key issues is that there's a lack of alignment within all of the different sources for development finance. So we're seeing the development finance space become a bit more complex. New players are coming in, particularly from the private sector, but there still seems to be a lack of coherence and cohesion when it comes to making sure that we're pooling resources as well as risks towards and directing it towards key areas that need financing for development. And then the second part to that is really connected to how we think about development finance, because even though the traditional sources for development financing are changing, we still very much look at these new models and try to apply those same approaches when we think about ODA, donor financing, to, for example, private sector, to corporate finance, to investor capital as well. And those old approaches simply won't work and won't apply to these new sources and new forms of development finance that we're trying to engage. So it's really about now, how can we shift, reframe our own thinking and mindset when it comes to finance and really embrace more innovative models, and what is then required in order to do that? Because it's very easy to say we need to have more innovative finance. We need to look at blended finance structures and public-private financing structures. But there are many steps to get to that, especially from the private sector side. And that's primarily where the Global Compact comes in. As I mentioned, we are a corporate sustainability initiative, and we focus primarily not on CSR, but on corporate sustainability. And there's a huge difference between the two. I think the global conversation, particularly among leading companies around the world, and definitely among some of the leading corporates in Africa, is changing now, in that we are starting to see more of an understanding that there's a huge difference and a wide chasm of understanding, and also operational implications when it comes to CSR and corporate sustainability, and how one versus the other very much is more about transforming existing business models to be more aligned to sustainable development. And that takes a lot more work, a lot more effort internally, but that also exists within an ecosystem. When you think about CSR, it is very much corporate philanthropy. It's about how corporates spend the money that they make and the revenue that they generate. However, corporate sustainability is actually about how you generate income and how you make money. So it's looking at your investment decisions as a corporate, your operations, your supply chains, your strategies, and whether or not those are aligned to sustainable development and how they impact both positively and negatively the sustainable development goals. So then what is the role, thinking about that private capital can play in terms of financing sustainable development, and how can the Global Compact and how does the Global Compact support? So as I mentioned, we're still very much stuck in this dominant paradigm of development finance, which is based on sort of the typical ODA structure, in which, you know, some entity, organization has money and then applies that money to a development project for specific objectives over a period of time. But development finance is very much changing, and I think those typical approaches are becoming quite outmoded. So it's really about looking at how we can not necessarily mobilize financing from private sector, from investors towards development, but again, redirecting and reframing existing resources that are already going towards business operations and making sure those business operations are then aligned to the SDGs. So that the investments that business is making through their everyday practices, decisions, operations, assets, is naturally being aligned to contribute and advance the sustainable development goals. And so there's a huge market opportunity that exists within the SDGs. The Business Council for Sustainable Development, I believe in 2017 or 2018, estimated that for Africa alone, there's a $1.1 trillion opportunity for investing in the SDGs that could lead to the development and creation of over 80 million jobs just in Africa through investment in food and agriculture, in health and well-being, in urban infrastructure development, and in energy. And I think thinking about this past year in light of COVID-19, when we see how all of these specific issues in these 4 key areas have been amplified, it really puts into stark reality how critical these systems are when you think about the many countries across the region that are facing crises of food insecurity now because of COVID. When you see how easy it is for the virus to spread in townships and low-income housing areas that have extremely high density of people and extremely low hygienic conditions, that are lacking proper water and sanitation infrastructure, lacking adequate electricity, or just how very quickly overwhelmed and constrained the health systems are here in Africa. So there's a huge potential for business to invest in these spaces for their long-term benefit, which in turn directly contributes to financing the SDGs by creating extra financial value through the products that they develop, the services that they offer, the business models that they develop, by providing social, environmental, and governance impact as well for society. And this isn't considered or wouldn't even be charity on the part of business, nor is it sort of traditional development finance as we know it. It would be business. It's the SDGs offering business a roadmap to where the market is going and shining a light on what the demands and needs of the market are. So it's less about how do we get private sector to fund the SDGs, and rather how do we transform existing business models in private sector so that they're naturally aligned to the SDGs, and through their very operation, they're advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. And so that is obviously a lot easier said than done, because this requires massive business transformation. There are so many different incentives, both at the top level, at the market level, but also at the individual level, just through simple things like individuals' key performance indicators that they have through their annual performance reviews in their corporations, that all affect the way in which business can negatively and positively impact the Sustainable Development Goals. So the challenge that we face in the Global Compact then is how can we start to really bring about a transformational shift in the way that business sees their purpose beyond profit, but also identify those specific opportunities in which business can actively contribute and therefore finance the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's many ways in which business can do that. I mean, I mentioned the specific market opportunities that just exist in those 4 key places or 4 key spaces within Africa. But also there's a lot that corporates can do in terms of addressing this challenge of financing the SDGs by providing access to finance in LDCs, least developed countries in Africa that have less developed financial markets. They don't have stock exchanges, and therefore this makes them less attractive to portfolio investors. So corporates can come in and, you know, using them as markets, bringing their products, their services, bringing job creation, they can provide access to finance to these countries in this way. Additionally, corporates and multinationals especially can link global capital markets to SMEs that can't directly access these markets by ensuring that they have inclusive supply chains and also setting specific targets for women and youth-owned businesses, because these are historically marginalized groups. And when you invest more in women, obviously in Africa, when you invest more in youth, these will have reap dividends that will have a factor of 10 rather than just incremental increases by percentage points. Finally, also, private sector can play a role as intermediaries to maximize the impact of downstream investments for the SDGs by ensuring that sustainable business practices that are aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals are embedded in their subsidiaries, in their suppliers as well. This is relevant for all corporations, but I think especially for the financial institutions, for banks who obviously play a key role when it comes to direct investments that they can make in individuals, in SMEs especially, and again, in women, in youth, and historically marginalized groups. So, I mean, I think really the key issue is that the annual investment gap is only going to grow. So we're only going to continue to have these discussions unless we start looking at what are the structural transformations that need to happen at all levels. Obviously, I mean, when it comes to any sort of structural transformation, much of it has to be state directed. And so the role of governments play in terms of policy decision-making is really key. But there's a huge role for business to play, and not necessarily in the role in just sort of generating resources to apply to development, but restructuring business in terms of the core operations to be realigned and redirected to the SDGs. And I see this, and in the Global Compact, we see this in two ways. It's really about mindsets and models. So mindsets is really focused around the corporate culture and leadership. And then models is in terms of how the business operates and how the business generates values. The model that the business uses to generate value needs to move from a more linear perspective into something that's more circular, more regenerative, and more inclusive. So in the Global Compact, that's the challenge that we face, is really trying to bring business to that transformation and embed these transformative thinking mindsets and models within business. Really, the key place to start is through awareness raising. It can seem frustrating sometimes when you have huge challenges within the SDGs. You have huge targets that are set, and actually a very short timeline in order to do this. At this stage now, we only have 10 years, 1 decade, to be able to address all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And so it can seem quite a slow start to start with something like awareness raising, which seems very simple and basic. But at the end of the day, that really is where you need to start, because it is quite difficult for companies to understand and even begin the process of mapping out where their impacts lie, not only internally within their business internal management practices, but also across their supply chains as well. And also in the larger ecosystem, looking at where they sit alongside their competitors within their specific industry as well, how they relate vis-a-vis the government when it comes to specific practices and policies that address their industry. So all of this requires a fundamental understanding of your operations, but also of the Sustainable Development Goals as well. I think in comparison to the MDGs, the SDGs have way more awareness raising overall, but still that level of awareness doesn't necessarily go into the practical applications of it and what it means for you as an individual in your role, in your job or in your organization, and also what it means for your company overall, again, within this larger ecosystem in which they operate. And so really training and capacity building is going to be the first step. And we do a lot of that at the country level through our Global Compact local networks across Africa, but also across the world. Our local networks mobilize hundreds, thousands of businesses to really get them to understand what is the role that my company has to play when it comes to addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. And then also, how can I understand how I'm actively on a day-to-day basis impacting the SDGs so that you can mitigate the negative impacts, but then also optimize and find new opportunities within those positive impacts as well. And again, linking back to the huge market opportunities that exist for the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is really a key place that we have to start in order to start to fundamentally unpack these challenges that business face. And once you begin the process of awareness raising and capacity building, you're then able to sort of open up the larger conversation and bring in other key stakeholders. So the role that civil society plays vis-a-vis business when it comes to addressing the challenge of supporting and advancing the SDGs. Of course, the role that governments play. Investors increasingly are playing a huge role. And I think especially when you have conversations around addressing the SDGs, particularly with non-state actors, a lot of times I think one of the sort of first defensive responses you get is that advancing the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Agenda, any sort of national development plan, is the role of the government. And absolutely the government is in the driver's seat when it comes to any sort of state-directed policies and structural transformation. I think that goes without saying. But increasingly, we're seeing non-state actors not only need to play a role, but have a huge role to play. I think business, especially when you think about their ability to direct the everyday lives of individuals and set policies that can lead to institutional norms as well as cultural and social norms, business is probably only second to government in terms of the level of influence that they have at a large scale. So it's really important to make sure that non-state actors are involved. And I think increasingly we're seeing that the challenges of SDG financing is very much shifting to a conversation in which business is playing now almost a leading role. And the investor community is definitely shaping up to also take leadership in this space. And so in the Global Compact, we're really focusing on trying to identify what are those key external levers that we can push and pull and manipulate in order to influence and encourage and challenge business to take on more of a leadership role and take more meaningful action when it comes to financing the SDGs. as I've said a couple of times, the investor angle is hugely important because obviously when it comes to business and investors, there's a very sort of clear hierarchy of needs there, in which business needs capital to grow, to make further investments, to be able to scale up. And that's typically where the investor community comes in. So the ability for investors to direct their finances and direct their investments towards sustainable development is a huge role that they can play in this space. And I think seeing the fact that we're now seeing more of a greater trends around the opportunities for responsible investment, we're now looking at a $30 trillion responsible investment market that's only going to increase and grow. These are all going to be factors that will affect how we're able to finance development and use more innovative models that bring the private sector, bring non-state actors into the conversation and have them take more of a leading role. So I'll stop there to allow for any questions, and future follow-up.
Nkiru, that's really fascinating. I'll definitely come back to you with a couple of questions. So I mean, some real highlights for me there were stuff about, reminding Africans especially that previous model of depending on aid, for example, is under threat. We need to be thinking differently about innovative financing models. One of the things we have battled as AVPA, as we've gone through this, is to try and ask ourselves, we recognize that the innovative financing space needs growth and development. And we've been thinking about creating programs to build capacity in that space. And in doing our research, we were quite shocked to find out that, if you wanted a knowledge partner in Africa, like a university or someone to help you drive an innovative financing program, you only have one university in Africa that has any semblance of an innovative financing program, and that's UCT. And that's totally shocking for a continent of this size. So we have now had to change to start thinking about how do we build capacity, and we're looking to run a program of creating like an alliance of African institutions who will become champions of innovative financing within their respective countries. So we can bring that capacity closer to the players, because currently it's shocking. If you want to run an innovative financing program, you've got to bring in Cambridge or bring in Duke or someone to run a program in Africa. And that just creates a problem. So really, really interesting. And we'll come back to it. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's Dr. Amarakun Bandara. He's a UNDP Senior Economic Advisor and Head of Strategic Policy and Inclusive Growth Unit at the United Nations Development Program in Nigeria. He's a champion for SDG, and you'll be glad to know that he's a former central bank governor in Sri Lanka. So Dr. Bandara, please, Bandara, over to you. Unmute yourself and please go ahead and speak.
Good morning, colleagues. Thank you, Frank, for your introduction. I'm not the former governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, but I have been there for long.
Okay.
Department, but I have been in the Monetary Policy Committee as well. Well, my subject is about the SDG financing gap, understanding the structure and scale of social investment. But my focus will be on the investment financing gap to achieve SDGs. I'm sure by now you are aware of how complex the SDGs are, and also given the fact that most of the developing countries, especially in Africa, including Nigeria, we had challenges in achieving the MDGs as well. But given the fact that the SDGs are more complex and wider, the challenges are also high. The financing gap in particular is huge. UNCTAD estimates that about the financing gap of about 3.3 trillion. You can't even imagine how big that number it is. Given these challenges, we need to think how to finance this gap, and as well as understanding what the critical challenges are in terms of sourcing this gap. Looking at the sectors that are more critical in terms of financing gaps, it is basically the transport sector, which is about $420 billion gap, and then power, which is also about $320 billion, climate change, another $300 billion, and then telecom and all these things are needing huge investments to achieve SDGs. If you look at the financing gap at the country level, it is mostly, especially in Africa, most of the countries have huge financing gaps. In terms of the volume, not necessarily the percentage-wise, Nigeria is on top. Most of the countries have these challenges, but unfortunately, Nigeria is on top of the countries because of its size, because of the challenges it has. But in terms of percentages, I think there are other countries like DRC and Central African Republic, simply because of their development challenges compared to the sustainable development goals that we are trying to achieve by 2030 is huge. Now, if you want to look at what are the challenges, we need to look at what are the financing sources that we look at usually. Usually we look at tripartite kind of relationship in terms of financing for development. One is public financing. The second one is private financing, both domestic private as well as private foreign financing. And then comes the donor financing. Now, the root and ongoing causes of these challenges are, like, say, for example, when you talk about domestic financing, there are two things we need to look at. One is about tax revenues. The other one is about domestic savings or private savings. Now, in terms of tax revenues, one of the challenges we see in most developing countries, which is relevant to Nigeria as well, is institutional weaknesses. How efficient are tax administration policies? Sometimes higher tax rates leads to higher tax evasion, corruption. There are a lot of leakages from the tax systems. Rules and regulations and also their implementation are sometimes complex. So these are affecting the revenue mobilization in most of these countries. Some of the countries, in fact, do not get anything out of their natural resources because of the weak enforcement systems. Transparency and accountability mechanisms are very weak. But if you look at the other side of the story, domestic private savings, which is very essential for financing development in all these countries. One of the things I have seen is the pricing on the financial instruments is very weak. If you look at countries like Singapore or Korea, and even at the early stages of 1960s, they were trying to see a positive real interest rate on deposits, but that is not happening in most of developing countries. In fact, it is in most cases negative. That doesn't influence savings rate. Even in institutional financing like the pension funds or insurance funds, if you have the key investment instruments for these kind of institutions, the treasury bill rate is the real return is mostly negative. So usually the return on those, real return on those is not conducive enough for these private financing to grow. But one of the things, as I said, in Korea and Singapore is they were looking at these trends and make sure that the investments or savings have real return to induce domestic savings. So that is one thing that constraining sourcing finance for development. And then other side of it is, as I said, the private financing flows like FDI or portfolio investment or remittances. In terms of FDI, one of the problems I see is policy and institutional challenges. Of course, the market size always matter because FDI wants to not just come in, but also make a market. And also there are some issues related to labor market, efficiency, as well as cost and flexibility of the labor market are sometimes key in driving foreign direct investment flows to the countries. And in terms of portfolio investment, again, policy environment key. Sometimes the consistency in the interest rate and exchange rate policies make a big impact in attracting portfolio investments. Lack of instruments, the market size again, rules and regulations related to repatriation are also matters in this area. When it comes to remittances, one of the key issues that we have seen is the lack of formal financial system that enables cost-effective transfer of funds from one country to another, from your own working place to home country is sometimes problematic. In fact, that is why sometimes the senders rely on informal mechanisms like hawala systems. And then these funds do not come into the formal financial systems. So it is important that we need to have these cost-effective systems, financial system, transfer systems, as well as rules and regulations to make these systems more effective. On the ODA side, one of the things we have is, one of the problems we see is the lack of effective systems to make the best use of these donor funds. Of course, donor-host country relationships matter in terms of attracting ODA. You have seen some countries get more, some other countries do not get donor funds at all in some cases. So the economic potential is very much relevant in attracting ODA, because it is not just free money that is coming into the country, because they see the potential impact on the welfare of the people and also the global economy. The country's role in the global arena also have a big impact on this side. Debt is also a key instrument in development financing. But it depends on the macroeconomic environment as well as political environment in the countries concerned. In terms of these policy filters, you will see that this matter because it all, as I said before, depend on the institutional, regulatory, and policy environment and how economies are performing. And more robust economies attract more financial flows. All the sectors that I have mentioned here and others will not. So even if they receive financial resources, they could be wasted if the systems are not efficient and efficiently utilized to the more productive sectors. This is happening elsewhere in most of the countries as well. So in terms of the role of private sector, I feel especially at a time when countries are going through a difficult time because of the pandemic, I think we need to look beyond public sector financing, give more incentives for the, through, say, for example, efficient public services, efficient institutional mechanisms for the private sector to perform well in this development arena. So what are the inherent risks that we see is the private sector is more profit-oriented. There may be, of course, within their operations, their corporate social responsibility mechanisms, but they are minuscule compared to their investment potential. So what it means is social investment may not necessarily be profitable unless they are innovative. So while public welfare gains may be high, the profitability could depend on the change in policy environment. In most of the countries, as I said before, there is inconsistency in policies. Today you see one policy, tomorrow it might change depending on the political regimes you have. That we need to avoid. In most cases, pricing of social goods and services are subject to regulation. In developing countries, these change from time to time. I think this is also affecting the private sector profitability. So these are some of the things that we need to address. As I said before, we need to have this strong tripartite partnership between public, private, and donor funding to maximize them to achieve the SDGs, especially through right policies and institutional mechanisms. I see in most of the countries, especially in developing countries, Africa, it may be higher, corruption is high, wastage is high. So these are some of the things that we need to look at. Some countries, in fact, some studies in some countries have pointed to huge illicit financial flows if we can if we close these the gaps, there are a lot of opportunities we can use some of the resources we have. It's not more a question of lack of resources. It is, especially in countries in Africa, they are very rich in natural resources, but they are not utilized properly. So these are some of the areas probably governments could think while also opening up to the private sector to maximize the gains, especially in a globalized economy where opportunities are huge. Let me stop here, but if you have any questions, I will be free to feel free to ask, and I will be happy to answer them. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bandari. I really appreciate it. That's a great thing. And you know, it's been interesting to just also look at the spectrum of money and sources of capital as we talk about financing SDGs. I want to move along because I want to create as much time as possible for questions from the audience a bit later in the webinar. So I want to take the next 15 or so minutes to listen to the next two speakers. So first of all, I'll ask Dr. Bala to speak next, and then we'll have Dr. Bolaji, Mr. Bolaji speak after that. So Dr. Bala, over to you for about 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Francis. It's difficult to speak when a senior colleague like Marakun has spoken on the same theme. But just to contextualize the challenge with the funding in the overall implementation of the SDGs in Nigeria, and what sort of mechanisms are being put in place to ensure that we all are on this together in terms of addressing the funding gap. So there is this issue about the domestic resource mobilization. We recognize the fact that we need to get the funding mix right if we are to make meaningful progress in the overall implementation and the achievement of the SDGs. So there is the domestic leg of the funding, and that has to do with the traditional sources of financing the SDGs. And so Nigeria, for example, it's a federal system with 36 states and the FCT and the federal government, and then the 774 local governments. In 2020, prior to the revision following COVID, the entire budget of the federation is about 20 trillion naira. And so if we all aim at ensuring mainstreaming of the SDGs, both at the national and at the subnational level, then we are saying that significant amount of that traditional sources will be channeled towards funding the SDGs in Nigeria. And to ensure that that fiscal space is broadened, the federal government recently, in January 2020, signed the new Financing Act or bill, which basically aims to broaden the tax base and strengthen the fiscal capacity to generate and mobilize more resources for development. And once that is achieved, the next thing should be to increase the National Social Investment Program, the size and the capacity, so that more people are benefiting from the investment program to address vulnerability. While that is happening, on the one side, we need to look at the non-traditional innovative sources of financing the SDGs. We've talked about the numbers, about the gap, you know, in terms of the resources that are needed. In fact, the Nigeria ISDG report 2019 estimated about 125 trillion between now and 2030. So that is huge by all standards, and therefore the non-traditional sources will have to complement the traditional sources. And you look at the issues around green bond, blue bonds, sukuk, impact investment, as well as the productive public-private partnerships. So private capital broadly, like Dr. Amarakun has mentioned. So these are all the pieces that we're working at, and all this fits in neatly into what Nigeria has just started doing. We have started the design and implementation of the integrated national financing framework for the SDGs, in line with the Addis Ababa Action agenda for financing development. And so if we successfully map out all these traditional and non-traditional sources and ensure that we get the private sector come into support and all the sources enumerated, even debt, reducing wastages, illicit financial flows and all that leakages blocked, then more resources will have been freed to address the gap in terms of funding the SDGs. So, like I said, I think Dr. Amarakun did justice by laying down the issues around the challenges in Africa. Obviously, Nigeria being the giant in Africa, so we are at the center of it. I would like to
Hello, Dr. Bala, did we lose you?
Oh yeah, so over, I'm done.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bala. I appreciate it. And it's great to see African governments embracing this challenge strongly. I think we've seen varying responses across the continent, but this is the whole purpose of us bringing up an African audience to this webinar so we can learn from each other. And we appreciate the diversity of people joining us on these webinars, and we hope to continue to have that much diversity, not just in the audience, but in the speakers as we go along. Next, I'll have Bolaji Balogun, who's joining us. He's Executive Officer of Chapel Hill Denham and CIO of the Nigerian Investment Debt Fund. Bolaji, I think it would be very interesting to hear your views about this particular topic, because the general sentiments are very much that without the participation of the private sector, there's no way Africa is going to meet its SDG financing challenge. And the question is, does the private sector understand the critical role it has to play in this? What's the level of commitment? And what needs to happen to enable the private sector to be active players in this space? So over to you.
Thank you very much, Frank, and good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I do apologize. I struggled a bit with the technology and getting connected. I'd rather like to start actually by rephrasing that question. I think the real question is, do governments in Africa, recognize the reality that their wallet is completely inadequate and that it's private capital and private sector to a large extent that's going to be responsible for narrowing the gap towards the attainment of all of the SDGs across the continent over the next few years. And if I just use Nigeria as an example, and being the largest, African market is probably most relevant. You have an economy essentially where this year's budget, which is $28 billion, is our largest ever budget. When you think about that budget as a factor of GDP, it's broadly 7.5% of the economy. So the first question that you ask yourself is, who is financing the other 92.5%? But it gets even worse than that. When you then look at how that $28 billion is spent, what you're going to find essentially is that every year, somewhere around 76 to 78% is spent on government expenditure, recurrent expenditure, as well as debt service. So only about 22 to 23% is actually going into what you describe as capital expenditure. When you then further dissect those numbers and you take out, purchases of vehicles, purchases of computers, by government, you're going to realize that the actual amount going into infrastructure, going into housing, going into healthcare and education is broadly, about 7% of that 22%. So you're talking basically about 1.6% of GDP. Now, on the other hand, contrast that with a nation in which population is growing at nearly 3% per annum. So what is pretty clear is that if we do not change the paradigm and begin to recognize that it's all about private capital, to a large extent, we're going to be completely behind. And once you recognize it's about private capital, then the first thing we have to do is to say, what is most important around private capital? And it's a variety of areas. It starts first and foremost with institutional capital, because to a large extent, on a global basis, if you and I think about all of the overseas development assistance that's available, and that's broadly talking about aid, talking about DFIs and all of their interventions, we're only talking about, on a global scale, adding the IFC, CDC, you know, all of the big DFIs internationally, we're talking about less than $2.5 trillion. Where the real depth is in the markets is in capital markets, it's in institutional funds that are managed globally, where today, the size of that is broadly about $135 trillion. The African Development Bank tells us that if it were possible for us to directionally point just 0.2% of that number towards investing in Africa and investing in a key area like infrastructure, which is the underpinning and the foundational catalyst in Africa, what you're potentially able to do is to deliver the attainment of all of the SDGs over the next decade. So it's all about, firstly, how we get the DFIs who have all the incredible experience working in developing markets around infrastructure, around SMEs, around housing, and we bring all of that knowledge together with the balance sheet of institutional capital, and then also recognizing that that institutional capital today is very, very much focused on ESG factors, and increasingly also all of the principles and businesses around institutional capital are increasingly thinking about their philanthropic, you know, obligations and their philanthropic commitments. If we can bring all of that together, then to a large extent, I think we're able to catalyze all of the facets of private sector and private capital, which are going to be important on this continent. I think once we all recognize that across governments, then what we're going to do is to focus our minds on what we must do to bring that capital and bring it very, very quickly. Because the one thing I will say finally is that what our continent needs beyond anything else is urgency. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Bolaji. So in summary, what I'm hearing you say, we need the different types of capital holders, the different types of players to come together, because it's not one particular type of capital that will solve our problem. We need to have philanthropists, like people holding grants, people holding private capital, governments, DFIs, really collaborating in trying to find a solution that's sustainable.
Yeah, but the real depth is in markets and with institutional capital.
Fantastic. Okay, that's very interesting. Great stuff. So please, I encourage you to type your question in the chat box. I'm going to go back to a question that's come from Gita to Kiru about to what extent is the private sector across Africa mobilizing to build the SDGs into its core business? So how much are they owning the SDGs? It's happening to some extent in South Africa, but I'm wondering what's the appetite? Yeah, so is the private sector committed to playing their role in this space, in essence? And do we have any examples? Do you have any examples that you can share with us, especially? Yeah.
So yes, I mean, it's a difficult question, because the private sector is so large and diverse. I think if you even just break it down by size, you find different levels of commitment. So obviously there's a lot more both to gain and to lose by not investing in sustainability for large corporates. The reputational risk for them is greater because there's more scrutiny on them. But also the opportunities are greater as well. They feed a much more diverse group of consumers that are increasingly more knowledgeable and aware of the impacts that their consumption habits have around the social, environmental, and governance impacts, not only in their own communities, but in other communities. At the SME level, at the lower tier supplier level, it's much more difficult to reach. There's less scrutiny there. There's less visibility as well. I think also the benefits are more difficult for them to see because their objectives tend to be more urgent, exigent, short-term, and investment in sustainability tends to be more long-term. You absolutely see a lot of great concrete examples across Africa. I actually saw there was a question about career impact bonds, or I forget, something about investing in the bond market for education. And there's a great example of Old Mutual based here in South Africa, where I live, looking at innovative financial vehicles in order to drive down the cost of quality education in primary and secondary school students in order to be able to leverage this ongoing trend of virtual and online education and bringing educational technology to a wider range of people in the country. So there are absolutely a lot of leading countries, not just in South Africa, but also in other key markets like in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Morocco as well, that are doing really innovative things around investing in renewable energy, investing in marginalized groups, particularly with the banking sector and a lot of the work that they're doing on women. I think Bank of Industry is a good example in Nigeria. Access Bank as well is a good example in Nigeria. But the key issue, and this is an issue across the board, not only in Africa, but really globally, but the key issue is the level of depth in which they go. Because that is, again, going back to what I was talking about earlier, requires business transformation and it requires companies to make fundamental changes to their incentive structures, to their reporting structures, performance structures. It also requires not only just a change in terms of different products and models, but also a change in the core business models that companies have. So these are long-term structural changes that businesses have to make. And when we also sort of take a very wide set view of corporate sustainability, it is still a very young and emerging field. I mean, the concept of CSR, which a lot of companies are still very much focused on talking about, is only about 20 to 30 years old. And now corporate sustainability, which is a much more advanced level of discussion and requires much more commitment from business, that's only probably about 10 years old. So there's a lot of emerging best practices across the board that we can see in Africa, but absolutely I would say there's an issue in terms of just the level of commitment and transformation it takes in order to fully invest and be fully aligned to the SDGs. It's just not there yet, and that's not an Africa issue. That's a challenge across the board, across many countries around the world and companies as well. But also it's quite difficult to do so when there isn't an enabling environment. And so again, you have to look at the ecosystem in which many of these companies play in, and which requires the right policies and regulation, requires policy coherence. It requires, better business environment. It requires investors that provide incentives for them to be structured and geared towards responsible business practices and sustainable development. So absolutely, we're definitely not there yet by any means. There are a couple of leaders, but what is considered a leading practice now, 10 years from now will be considered standard practice, just like 10 years ago, what we considered leading now is standard practice. But yeah, there's still a long way for us to go in terms of actual integration.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Bandara, if I can ask you to come in here. When you look at Africa, or basically the emerging markets, do we have certain countries who have demonstrated really good plans in trying to address this SDG financing gap? And then I recognize that COVID has thrown everything into a spin, but looking especially in Africa and Asia and Latin America, do we have certain countries that we believe are taking a lead that we could learn from? I'll just ask Dr. Bandara to unmute himself, please.
Thank you. Yes, of course, this is a challenging issue, but I think it is still provide a lot of opportunities. And you have seen some of the countries in Africa are doing very well. I would say in terms of countries who are doing very well on SDGs and also financing, say Mauritius and Seychelles. You have seen some countries doing well in terms of SDG achievement as well in many areas. But it all depends, as I said before, how well they manage their economy create an environment for private sector, especially domestic investment as well as the foreign private investment. These things make a huge impact. I have seen in countries like, say, for example, Mauritius or Seychelles, they have gone far ahead of most other countries, and they are also on top of this SDG financing or SDG achievement, as well as lower financing gaps. There are other countries as well, like, say, for example, the Ghana and other countries. South Africa is, in fact, in terms of SDG financing gap, it is one of the countries having the lowest gap because their requirements are very much closer to the financing resources available compared to most countries in Africa. So it is a plus point. In countries like Angola, so for example, financing available because of maybe oil revenue and other natural resource revenues is high. But what matters in most in these countries is how efficiently you utilize whatever the resources available, especially in relation to natural resources, because those are abundantly available in Africa. In some cases, you tend to just sell raw materials without adding value. In some cases, it just passes through borders without the knowledge of the treasury authorities or the customs. It happens in many countries. But in most countries, the problem area is the, as discussed earlier by other colleagues, is the lack of conducive environment for the private sector to thrive in these countries. So you tend to think that it is always better to get the outsiders coming here rather than providing an enabling environment for private sectors to domestic private sector to do their job within the countries. Say, for example, if you look at the Africa SDG Index dashboard for 2019, the best ranked country is Mauritius with an aggregate score of 66, implying that the country is on average 60% of the way to the best possible outcome across all 17 goals by 2030. So it is far ahead of other countries. But there are some other countries like Botswana or Ghana or Rwanda. I'm sure you have seen Rwanda progressing very well, especially in terms of ease of doing business and attracting foreign investment in, especially in the technology side, because Rwanda doesn't have anything else, not like other African countries. It doesn't have natural resources to exploit with. So they tend to move to the technological side, use the youth population and the innovations to reap the benefits of those available resources. Botswana, of course, has a very good transparency and accountability mechanisms to exploit resources from the natural resource sector, especially in diamonds. So those are some of the areas and countries that are doing very well. So I would assume there are opportunities to exploit these conditions by other countries as well, by putting in place stronger regulatory mechanisms, enhancing the efficiency of public sector institutions. Like, say, for example, if you want to attract foreign investment, how efficient you are in terms of providing support to those needs of outsiders, because they always compare one country with other alternative options available in terms of investment opportunities. We are trying to, in fact, ease that gap through SDG Impact Initiative that UNDP is trying to do. There are several other initiatives as well by private sector. And you have seen, we have launched something called integrated national financing frameworks to make sure these different financing flows, financial system work in collaboration, in synergy with others to achieve the common goal. So the government knows where the money goes, where the money is coming, where the opportunities are. So if the systems are efficient, we can make the best out of it. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Fascinating. Dr. Bala, from a policy perspective, what is the Nigerian government looking to do to kind of stimulate this space to go along, to support the private sector, to encourage a lot more players to come and deliberately support the government in meeting these SDG targets?
Okay, so thank you very much for that. I'm happy to see the private sector group on SDGs in Nigeria. And the government through this office is doing is to ensure that organized private sector is supported through fiscal incentives to be able to contribute implementation of the SDGs. And I think just before the COVID, private sector advisory group under the leadership of Mobilizing there met with the Honorable Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning to discuss incentives around a sort of fund together or put together the invigoration of, for example, basic education in Nigeria. So each private sector participating in that scheme will get some sort of incentive, if you like, tax incentive and support to enable the organized private sector participate meaningfully within the SDG space and attract that private sector we talk about. I will mention about the 20 which basically aims to the additional messages. But so abroad in this, I think Bolaji can shed more light on that initiative by the private sector advisory group in SDGs in Nigeria. Over.
Yeah, Bolaji, taking on what a couple of things you mentioned when you did your opening remarks around the involvement in the private sector, do you get a sense that the private sector does have an appetite to actively play their role in supporting the broader development of the government? And I think it's a give or take in many cases. So as much as we want the government to do certain things, what do you think the private sector should also be doing in their own space to be more of a kind of, a good citizen to the countries in which they operate in?
Okay, so without doubt, I think first and foremost, I would say that there are a myriad of private sector companies who are already doing a tremendous amount, even without any form of incentive in place. So when you think about, businesses in Nigeria, from Dangote Group, to Lafarge, to Oando, to Sahara, there are already very, very substantial bases, Unilever, Coca-Cola, they're very substantial and deep bases of private sector businesses today who already have very, very large commitments across a variety of areas, whether it's what they do in education, in healthcare, even in infrastructure in many, many instances. And what we're simply looking to do is to bring more and mobilize more, sort of in the form of a call to action. And we think that one of the elements, that can really move that is to try and figure out how we utilize, some of these tax, payables that are made by private sector investors and align payment of tax essentially with structures that can be utilized, to catalyze either investments into healthcare or into education or into infrastructure. So just as an example, the taxes paid by the largest 20 companies listed on the stock exchange in Lagos last year are larger than the amount of money that went into primary education, from the federal budget. So if it were possible, for example, to create a structure where there is an incentive provided to these companies to invest that capital direct into education at that primary level, the impacts can be quite catalytic. And there are a variety of other initiatives like this that are in development across the private sector. There's a similar one ongoing around healthcare. There's already an existing one, which was developed through a, collaboration between the federal government and, a number of private sector participants around, road construction. And I think what I'm really excited about is the reality in Nigeria today that the government cannot do it alone. The private sector clearly recognizes that if it does not step up to the plate, there will be a gap. But it's about how we all recognize that these are only small stats, and how do we scale it and scale it very, very quickly. And how do we also get all of those other pockets of private sector capital beyond just philanthropy, beyond these segments that I talked about, and we begin to actually interest, institutional capital. And some of the stuff that we do in the Nigerian Infrastructure Debt Fund is a good example of that. So 3.5 years ago, no Nigerian pension fund had any investments or exposure to infrastructure as an asset class. We've created a vehicle which is focused on investing on all the infrastructure asset classes. Today, 23 of Nigeria's 28 pension funds are invested in infrastructure and, have more than a couple of $100 million very, very quickly. And if we were to look at that sector in 3 to 4 years' time, I won't be surprised if you had billions of dollars invested by domestic pension funds. And this is a structure that's replicable all over Africa in any markets that has large formalized pension schemes, and it's scalable very, very quickly. So it's about recognizing that we must utilize all of the benefits that markets provide us to bring together all of the participants, from governments to DFIs and development partners, to philanthropy, to private capital, to private businesses and entrepreneurs and family offices, as well as private institutional capital. And markets give you a very transparent platform for doing so. And transparency, I put it to you, is also really important on our continent. It's not coincidental that everybody calls Africa the dark continent. It's got nothing to do with the color of our skin. It's just to do with the lack of opacity. I mean, the opacity and the lack of transparency around a lot of the data. And if you cannot measure, if you cannot see transparently and clearly, you cannot solve a problem.
Excellent. So for all the speakers, I'm going to come back to you to give us your closing comments in sort of 2 minutes. But before then, Nkiru, a question for you here. Are there any frameworks that are tracking how the private sector is investing in SDGs in Africa? And if so, do we have any tangible outcomes of the practice?
Yes, so in terms of frameworks specific to SDG investment, there are increasingly frameworks coming out on SDG investment globally. Specific to Africa, UNCTAD has done some work in terms of tracking this. The majority of, well, not a majority of, but a good percentage of SDG investments, so bonds and other financial vehicles that are specifically aligned to or targeted for the SDGs and show or are meant to guarantee impact on the SDGs, we see increasingly are being delivered or for projects in the Africa region. So already we're seeing a lot of uptake in that. Primarily in the climate space, we are seeing a lot of interest now, and I actually just put something in the chat, in countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, where we see both on the public and the private side, financial mobilization through the bond market and through green bonds primarily and other investment vehicles towards climate and renewable energy. And so that's one key area where we're seeing a lot of SDG investment aligning in Africa. On the social side, it's not quite there yet, particularly on key issues like investment in education, investment in gender equality and women's empowerment. But on the climate side, we are seeing a lot of progress, particularly in key markets that are a bit larger and have more diversified portfolios for investment in sustainable development.
Awesome, thank you. So in closing, we've got about 8 minutes at the end of the webinar. Can I have each speaker kind of take 1 minute, starting with Dr. Bala, just summarizing your key messages that you want the audience to take away in terms of this particular topic and the problem we're trying to solve around SDG financing. Dr. Bala, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So basically, the task of delivering the Sustainable Development Goals has to be all inclusive in a whole of society, whole of government approach. The government itself can't do it, and therefore with respect to bridging the financing gap, we need to look at innovative financing mechanisms that can be scaled up to complement the domestic and traditional sources of financing development to ensure that we are on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by the year 2030. This conversation should continue, and basically look forward to benefiting from the outcome of such conversation as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bala. Mr. Bandara, your thoughts?
Thank you. As I said before, this is a huge initiative, but it can have a greater impact on the development arena, especially in Africa, where the development is compared to most other countries is low. So it is an opportune time, especially when we are going through this pandemic, to rethink about how the development process is crafted. As mentioned earlier, also linking the policy narratives to the budgetary processes, as creating policy as well as institutional environment that is conducive for all stakeholders, not just the public sector, but especially for the private sector and the individuals as well, where they can do their part. We have started the Decade of Action at the UN, at the global level as well. So it is good to partner with everybody to have these development frameworks in place and implement them. One of the problems I have seen in most developing countries is that they have wonderful development plans, but they are not implemented properly. And also we need to make sure the consistency of policies give a right message to the potential investors and other stakeholders. And also have a public service sector that will enable innovations and moving forward, especially in a country like Nigeria, say for example, the majority of the population is youth, but we are not adequately giving them opportunities to thrive, make the best out of the opportunities available, and also creating new opportunities. There may be opportunities coming through new initiatives like the African Free Trade Area. These are some of the things, new things that we could consider in the years ahead. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Bernard. Mr. Bolaji, your closing remarks?
Thank you very, very much. And, you know, I think the message to share with everyone is to say that there's some really excellent foundations on the continent, but there's so much more that we can all do. And, I think, we all have no choice but to do it, because to a large extent, the continent relies on us to mobilize this capital.
Thank you. And Nkiru?
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and thank you to the other panelists for the robust conversation, as well as all the participants involved. I think I would just leave by saying I talked earlier about needing the mindset shift and how we think about the SDGs and financing the SDGs. And I think that really starts with us talking less about financing the SDGs and more about investing in the SDGs. Financing is a burden, investing is an opportunity, and that's what we need to look at the SDGs, because that's what they are. They're an opportunity for business, an opportunity for governments, and an opportunity for all. So it's about how can we invest in the sustainable development goals for long-term, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable growth for all.
Thank you. Financing is a burden, investing is an opportunity. Those are powerful words there, Nkiru. And I think the basic thing that we recognize is we've lagged behind on many fronts. As Bolaji was also saying, the reference to us as a dark continent has many connotations. Part of it is us being left behind from a development perspective as well, not just lacking transparency. And it's really time that we started owning the trajectory in which we take this continent going forward. And this is the beginning of a series of conversations that AVP will be organizing to try and bring different players to better unpack some of these issues so we can understand how to solve them in days to come. As Toyin mentioned at the beginning, and I'm sure she'll close with that, we are going to be doing a couple of these webinars almost on a monthly basis. We're super excited about just getting plugged into helping Africa broadly and Africans who are playing in this space broadly understand what's the problem we're trying to solve. Fundamentally, that is what would make us move forward better in more cohesion and able to move resources and knowledge across much faster. So in days to come, we're going to be doing quite a couple of interesting things. We are about to launch a deal share platform in the next couple of days, sort of 3-4 weeks. And we're looking really excitingly to pilot that platform to support especially the smaller ticket size investors who are deploying under $10 million across the spectrum, from philanthropists to mainstream capital players. And we also intend to help a lot of these investment opportunities get exposure globally, leveraging our footprint through our sister networks in Asia and Europe as well. We are also going to be launching an agenda platform in also the next 3 to 4 weeks. Very excited about what that could do to the gender space in Africa. And we'll be trying to ring fence initially communities around gender lens investing, health and safety, and economic empowerment and livelihoods within the gender space. So look out for that. And then in early October, we're also going to be launching a study that we've been running since November last year. And it's a social investment mapping study that's looking at the social investment landscape in 9 countries across Africa, 3 in East, 3 in South, and 3 in West Africa. So there's plenty coming. We are very keen to partner with people. So if there are organizations out there who are looking to run initiatives that would support this social investment space in Africa, please reach out to us. And it's right across from philanthropists to private players, corporates. This is what we're here to do, to help you grow and multiply and magnify your impact. And collectively, we can add more to the continent than we can individually. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll have Toyin do the closing remarks. But others, thank you so much for making your time. Please look out for the other webinars, and I've put my email in the chat. So if you do feel to get in touch with me, by all means, go ahead. Toyin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Frank. And a really big thank you to all of our, a big thank you to all of our members, to our speakers, our distinguished speakers, who have really given us a lot of food for thought for today. And I just want to really, I'm getting feedback. I don't know if everybody else is as well. Okay, now, at this point, would just like to thank all of our speakers, Dr. American Bandera, Mr. Bolaji Balogun, Ms. Nkiru Chiamelu, and Mr. Bala Yunusa for your wonderful insights on the topic of closing the sustainable development gaps. And I think Nkiru's message rings really clear to all of us, or you know, in terms of really looking at this as an, you know, the gaps, the funding gap as an opportunity, an investment opportunity. And also, you know, again, hearing from Dr. Bala and Dr. Amerikun around the importance of collaboration. So public and private sector coming together, collaborating in order to close the gap. And finally, from Mr. Bolaji Balogun, really talking about the urgency, the importance of institutional capital, the capital market, and the fact that the private sector take the lead. And so with that said, just want to say thank you again for everyone for joining us today. And our next webinar will be September 17th, next month. So please look out for the invitation. And as we say during these days, please stay well, be safe, and take care of yourself. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Stay well.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay
Bye.
safe.
Great webinar.
Thank you, everyone. It was a great webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really enjoyable. Thank you, AVPA. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you just stay on for a bit?
What did you say?
Just
Frank?
stay on for a just stay on
Yes,
for a bit.
yes.
Yeah.
We can stay on for a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Has everyone logged off? No, there's still some people.
We still
Yeah.
have a few.
Yeah. Let me import. Okay, Toyin, let me.
Did you hear?
Just hang on a second.
Yeah.
Okay, Toyin, I'll stop the recording. Then I'll find you on WhatsApp. Eh?
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, just hold on a second.